Hello, church family. Thank you for joining us online. We are so grateful to have you. And listen, if this is your first time joining, we are so honored that you decided to join us. Whether you're watching this in your home or maybe listening to it in your car, or maybe today you find yourself lonely, angry, frustrated, depressed, overwhelmed by life, we believe that God, He wants to speak to you today. And maybe you're full of joy. Maybe you got so much hope. I want to encourage you that God wants to continue to be a light to your path, and we believe the Word of God, it's powerful. So lean into this message, check it out, and we'll be with you right after this.
I really want to share something today that kind of jumps off the back of what Julia shared in the last service. Babe, why don't you turn up so everyone can see you? This is my wife, Julia. My wife of 30 years. We've been married 30 years, and she spoke in the last service about clearing the way for Jesus. And so I want to talk a little bit more off the back of that. She talked about clearing a way for Jesus. I want to talk just a fraction about Jesus, about who he is and some of his attitude and character and some of the style and the way he does things, because we're all meant to be more like him. And the more like him we are, the better the world is around us. Isn't that true? And so I want to talk about the righteousness of God. Which is a big term, righteousness. Maybe you've heard it. I'm aware that some of you have been following Jesus for some time. Some of you are new to faith. Some of you are new to THE. Can I say, one of the things we say back home is take the 4-week challenge. You know, you can spend 4 Sundays. You can spend 4 weeks looking around at different churches and not knowing. But why don't you spend 4 weeks in the same church? Because every time you come, it's something different, somebody different things happen, different connections, different conversations. Why don't you take up the 4-week challenge? Why don't you come here for 4 weeks, back to back, and then make a decision? Just do 4 weeks, yeah? Give it 4 weeks and see what happens, because I reckon you'll love it. I reckon you'll fall in love with this place, and this place will fall in love with you. So let's take a look at this. We want to look at the righteousness of God. And let's talk about righteousness not from an immorality side. Oftentimes when we think of righteousness, you probably think of morality, immorality, like right and wrong and how you do things, how you live life. Well, that's a righteous person. Oh, they're an unrighteous person. And many times righteousness is looked at from the angle of morality. I want to bring it to you from the aspect of hospitality. Because righteousness has a lot more to do with hospitality than we've realized. A lot more. It's the way God is hospitable to us. It's the way he invites us. Hospitality it's an invitation of inclusion. Isn't that what God does? He invites us. He includes us. It's sometimes easier to call people out for their immorality than it is to call people in for a meal. And righteousness is more about involvement than it is about segregation, than it is about saying, I'm right, you're wrong, so we can't talk. That's not righteousness. Because if that was righteousness, God would never be able to hang out with us. But he invites us in, invites us for a meal, which is why John's talking about if you're thirsty, if you're hungry, the invitation stands. Come, all who are thirsty, all who are hungry. Come and eat, come and buy without money. That's a strange thought. Without cost. Psalm 37 verse 4, I want to start here. Take delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Take delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Sometimes if you read this, oftentimes when we read scripture, it's reading us. And maybe what we think there is if you delight in the Lord, he'll give you whatever you want. Is that what it says? It could be, couldn't it? If I delight in God, if I come to church, he'll give me whatever I want. So you have this big shopping list of all the things you want. If you delight in the Lord, he'll give you whatever you want. Maybe that's not what it's saying. Maybe what it's saying is, you know the days you wake up after hanging out with God for a little time, and when you hang out with God, you can't stay the same. And so what happens is you start to find that your desires change, and you wake up sometime in the future and you realize that you've got these different desires. You want to help people. You want to serve people. You notice things that you never used to notice before. You notice people that are without. You notice people that are hurting. You notice people that are marginalized. And if you stop for a moment and think about these things, people might even say to you, you've changed. You're different. You never used to care about that. Where do those desires come from? Well, if you delight yourself in the Lord, he'll give you those desires. That's where those desires come from. The desire to help people comes from the Lord. The desire to save, the desire to reach out, the desire to include, the desire to make things better That comes from God. That's what he does. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Jules read this in the last service. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. He started it and he can finish it. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy set before him. There's an area in the app right now, if you're on there, you can take your own notes. Start taking some notes about this thought. What was the joy set before Jesus? What would make him desire to stay upon the cross? The humiliation of that, the shame, the torture. It was the greatest torture method in the Roman Empire. They were trying to figure out a way to kill somebody the slowest possible that have the most excruciating death. That's why the cross. It was reserved for the worst of criminals. And Jesus was counted among them. Though innocent, he was crucified. And the joy set before him, he stays. He endured the cross, which means we could say he stayed on the cross. You see, there was a thief on either side who couldn't do anything. If you're on a cross, you can't come down. But when you're God, you can come down. You can sneeze and everyone disappears. The maker of humanity, the God of the heavens and the earth, he stays on the cross. And that's not what is so impactful. What impacts me the most is not that he stayed on the cross, but he let us kill him. Such is his love that lacks control. He doesn't control anybody, so much so that he lets us kill him. He consents even to our non-consent. That's why he lets us live our own life. That's why he lets us run away. That's why we can come to him and we can run away again and we can come back again and we can run away again and we can come back again. And the whole time he lets us come back and he also lets us run away. Though it hurt him, though it saddened him, he lets us go. Such is his love. Love doesn't control. It doesn't keep people. It lets them go. And as much as we destroy our own lives every time we run away, he lets us go. Why did he stay on the cross? What was the joy that was before him that he would stay on the cross? We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that and what we think that means. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says, God made Jesus... God made him is Jesus. God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. There it is. That's what we're going to talk about. God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us. It's kind of a strange translation. It's like God can't make you can't become sin any more than you can become a table. It's a poor translation, that one. That one's in the NIV. I'm glad you're reading the NLT. Oh, am I not allowed to say that? I'll show you what I mean. That word, God made him who had, the word had in Greek is actually gnosko. It means to know. It's what we were talking about the other night. About in Hebrew, it's yada. It means to know. And that word knowledge, it's not just knowing that my name's Joel. It's knowing a whole lot more about me. So the word to know, God made Jesus who knew no sin. The new is gnosko, which means to know by intimate experience. It's to have this intimate experience or to have knowledge of. And so God had made Jesus, who obviously had no intimate knowledge or experience of sin, and in this version it says to become sin, which is not a great translation. If you look at the next version, NLT, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the sin offering. So he's an offering for our sin. He doesn't become sin. He's an offering for our sin. All this Old Testament, old scripture typology that's all coming right to a climax. God made Jesus, who had never had any intimate knowledge or experience of sin, to be the offering for our sin so that in him we might be made right with God through Christ. Or what about the next version? In the Catholic Septuagint, it says, Christ was without sin, but for our sake God made him share. There's that gnosko word. to know by intimate experience of knowledge. But God made him share our sin in order that in union with him, we might share the righteousness of God. So God doesn't know sin. He has no experience or intimate knowledge of sin, yet he comes down to earth and becomes like us to experience how we suffer in temptation in order that through that suffering we might be able to share his righteousness. That's what that verse is saying. So what is this righteousness? Well, many would say it means to be made right. And sure, that's true. But it's far more profound than that. What is this righteousness of God? Let's look at another verse. Romans chapter 3 and verse 25. This one says, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate. Somebody say demonstrate. In New York, say demonstrate. No, that's New York. Demonstrate. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness. To demonstrate his righteousness. Because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. You might want to write some things in your notes right now. Because another translation might be a little bit more helpful for us. It's in the NET, the New English Translation. The NET translation, I'm not sure if I gave it there, but it's inside your notes there on the app. God publicly displayed him at his death as the mercy seat accessible through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness. The mercy seat. So the first verse was God made Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. The second one says as the mercy seat. Now, have anyone seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? You seen that movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? Temple of Doom, all those types of ones. Harrison Ford. Remember when they actually captured the Ark and the bad guys, the Nazis, had it up on the hill and he was saying, don't look at the light, whenever you do, don't look at it, because they lifted the lid. And as you lift the lid, what comes out is the glory of God. I mean, that wasn't in the scriptures, that part, but it's a fun movie. But the whole point is for us to get a visual that the Ark of the Covenant, when you lift the lid, but you wouldn't, would you? You would never touch it. You don't touch it. Don't lift the lid. But if you did lift the lid, what's inside? There's the law, the Ten Commandments. There's Aaron's staff that had budded. And there was some of the manna that God fed miraculously the children of Israel for all those days. That's what's inside the box. The Ark of the Covenant has the law inside. If you lift the lid, but you wouldn't, because we've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you had a look inside, you'd see the law, the Ten Commandments. The lid is called the mercy seat. That's where they'd sacrifice animals and the blood would go on top of the lid, the mercy seat, because mercy is always over judgment. Wow. The law speaks of judgment. The mercy seat is what comes over judgment. The mercy seat covers you. It protects you, which is why it's saying here that God demonstrates his righteousness by coming down to become like us, and on the cross, his life is poured out so that mercy covers over judgment. That's what he's trying to do. So how did he demonstrate his righteousness? What does it mean to demonstrate righteousness? Well, maybe if we understood what the word righteousness means, especially in Hebrew, because we read this in English, maybe you read it in a different language, but it was translated a lot. The first part of the Bible was in Hebrew, the second part was Aramaic Greek, and we get it all now in English. But still, even though the new parts were written in Greek, it was still a Hebrew mindset. So the Hebrew understanding of righteousness is this word sadak. I think it's T-Z-I-D-A-Q or A-K sometimes. Sadak or sadaka. Sadak is righteousness. Well, in Hebrew, the Hebrew language was written in hieroglyphics because, remember, they were trapped in Egypt for all those years. Remember the big story of Moses, and they come out with all those plagues, and they come out and then they start as a family, and now they're a nation, and now they grow, and then eventually they become this great big country called Israel. Well, they were in Egypt, so when they come out, it makes sense that the Hebrew language was in hieroglyphics, which means every letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a little picture, and a picture that tells a story. Well, get this, the 3 picture letters for tzedakah, which is the Hebrew word for righteousness, the first, it's Sadi, Dalet, Kof. And Sadi is a picture of a fishhook with bait on it, which means it's the thing that lures you, it draws you in. That's Sadi. Dalet is a picture of an open door that you walk through. And the word Kof, that letter Kof, is the back of a head. And if you're with somebody who is less than you, somebody who feels less than you, feels intimidated by you. I saw someone walk into church in the last service and they walked in like this. They just didn't feel worthy, which is so sad to be in a place where God accepts you, to walk in like that. But what do you see when someone walks like that? You see the back of the head. And so this is talking about people who feel less, they feel inferior, they feel marginalized, they feel like they don't belong. That's the back of the head. So here's what righteousness is, right? It's this thing this desire that draws you, an open door that you walk through for people who you see the back of the head. Righteousness is when you have a deep desire to open the door and make a way for people who are less. That's what righteousness means. Sadak. It's this deep desire to open the door and make a way for people. Isn't that what God does? Isn't that what he did with us? Righteousness is my deepest desire to open the door and make a way for those who are poor and vulnerable. Anybody that I can see that I can help. Righteousness, to demonstrate righteousness is to demonstrate a desire to open the door and make a way for people. That's what it means. Righteousness is not just what you say, it's also what you do. It's not just what you do, it's who you are. Righteousness, we say it this way, you can't claim to be righteous without doing righteousness. It's what we do, it's how we live, it's how we act. 1 John 4:19 says, we love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. Because it's not just what you say, it's what you do. We can't say that we have faith and live opposite to that. It's how we live. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And anyone who has given us this command, anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. And if that's not strong enough, check out what it says in James chapter 2, verse 17. So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Unless it produces good deeds. In the Hebrew, that is, unless it produces tzedakah. Faith by itself doesn't work unless it produces tzedakah, unless it causes a desire to well up on the inside of us to open the door and make a way for people. That's what tzedakah is. That's what faith does. It causes us to make a way for people. In fact, if you look at Matthew chapter 6, it's when Jesus is giving that message, that Sermon on the Mount, and he says to the people who are listening, he says, when you're offering your acts of tzedakah, don't do it for everyone to see. Do it in private. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Remember that passage? That's what he's talking about, tzedakah. When you are doing that, don't try and make a big trumpet blast about it. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand was doing. And in that culture, and in some cultures around the world, the left hand is the dirty hand. That's the hand that you use for the bathroom. And the right hand is the one that you greet with, you eat with, you do everything with. And so if you wanted to shame some people in that culture, you'd chop off their right hand so that they had to eat and greet and do the toilet with their left hand. So don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. He's saying don't let your unclean hand know what your clean hand is doing. When you give, when you serve, when you help, the unclean hand is the one that wants everyone to know what I'm doing. But we serve with this natural intention and desire to want to open the door and make a way for people. It's this righteousness. It's this way that we do things. So let's go back to where we started. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. What was the joy set before Jesus? God's deepest joy was to open the door and make a way for all of us who were estranged and vulnerable. We were poor, blind, naked, and ashamed, and God was in Christ reconciling the whole world to himself. God's not this angry God that's trying to pay you back for things that you deserve. He is a loving Father who has always wanted to invite you in. That's why righteousness is more about hospitality than it is about right and wrong. When we use righteousness, we divide people. We say who's allowed to come in and who has to stay out. But because God demonstrates his righteousness, he invites us all. Isn't that the profound part about love? That while we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly? That's his righteousness. God demonstrating his righteousness is the way that he loves, the way that he invites and includes. He does this all the time. Jesus was always doing this. There's this one time, Jesus is teaching some people. There's a crowd gathered around, and these religious leaders who did not understand righteousness, they didn't want to just demonstrate the love of God. They were all about rule keeping and about separation. They were all about keeping that if you can get into church if you had the right status and the right bank account. And the poor were always left out. You go back to those days, and many of us would not have been allowed to come into church. And Jesus broke all that. He's like, no, whoever wants to come. If you're thirsty and hungry, you can come. Anybody can come. And it frustrated the church leaders back then because they had this great money-making business on the side where everybody who came in was actually lining their pockets. And if you couldn't afford it, you couldn't get in. And so there's one time, so Jesus took everything outside the building. He would teach in the park. He would teach by the lake. He'd teach everywhere. He'd go to synagogue. He'd go to church, but he'd teach everywhere so that everyone could hear that God is not against you. He's not angry with you. He wants you. He loves you. So there's one time, Jesus, he's teaching the crowds. And these religious people, they catch this woman in the act of adultery. I mean, just think about that for a moment. They catch her in the act of adultery. The man doesn't show up, just the woman. Which means they've probably framed this woman so that they can have a go at Jesus. So they don't care about the woman, so much so that they actually cause a man to be with this woman so that they can catch her to bring her to Jesus, and they throw her down on the ground in front of this crowd where Jesus is teaching. And this is what they say. The law says that you are to stone a woman who's committed adultery. You are to stone a woman to death. But what do you say? Now, if you read through these things over and over again, you start to see some patterns. And the pattern is when they say, the law says, but what do you say? It's because Jesus, remember on the Sermon on the Mount, would say things like, you've heard that it was said, but I say. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you. You've heard you can love these people, but hate these people, but I say to you. You've heard that it was said this, but I say to you. It's because he was a rabbi who was interpreting the Torah. And only rabbis were allowed to interpret Torah. Everyone else had to follow the rabbi, which is why later in Corinthians, Paul's saying, man, some of you are saying, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Christ. It's because everyone follows their different rabbi. So Jesus is a rabbi who's reinterpreting the scriptures because we've gone off track. And that's why they were saying, they threw this lady down. They say, the law says that we're to stone this woman to death. And it does, it's true. The law actually does say that. It's what the law says. What do you say? And so Jesus is here to demonstrate righteousness, which is inclusion, hospitality. How does he get out of this one? Because the law does actually say that in Leviticus. So we know from the story, he bends down and he starts drawing in the dirt. He hasn't given an answer yet, and they're demanding an answer. The law says, what do you say? He stands back up and he says, okay, whoever has never sinned can throw the first stone at her. And it says, starting with the oldest to the youngest, they all started to drop their stones and they left until there was no one left, no accusers left. And so Jesus bends down and he says to the woman, look at the hospitality. He says to the woman, where are your accusers? Side note, in the Levitical law, it also says that no one is allowed to put anybody to death except by 2 or more witnesses. What has Jesus just successfully done? Removed all the witnesses. They're all gone. Whoever wants to throw the first stone, if you've never sinned, throw the first stone. And all the witnesses, all these angry men, the law says that you are to stone this person to death. That's true. On 2 or more witnesses. If you've never sinned, throw the first stone. They all start leaving. There's none left. There's no accusers left. Nobody who was in that situation that saw what happened, that framed that woman, none of them left. So Jesus can uphold the law by removing every accusation. He says to this woman, where are your accusers? And she says, none. They're all gone. He says, well, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave this life of sin. That's what he does. He removes the accusation. He fulfills the law because love is the fulfillment of the law. How does he demonstrate righteousness? By opening a door and making a way for people. You were sharing in the last service about the passage you guys have been reading. I think today, the man at the pool of Bethesda that's being healed, right? This other one time, Jesus walks into this area, to this pool of Bethesda, and this man, and what happened? The backstory is that every now and then the water gets stirred, and whoever jumps in first is healed. It's actually a placebo effect. It's not real. They say it's an angel that stirs the water because they made money off it. Because the leaders, the religious leaders, whoever paid the most got to sit closest to the front of the pool. And so the more money you had, the better the seat you had, which is why this man who was crippled for 38 years was never able to get close enough so that when the water stirred, he could get in to get healed. And do you know why the water actually stirred? It wasn't because an angel stirred it. This pool of Bethesda was just the backflow pool of the temple god, which was behind the wall. And there's a big pagan god that they worshipped, and that had a big pool moat at the front for the people who were really well off and up to do. And so when it flooded, it would go out into this pool, and they would open this kind of like a little outlet thing to make sure that it wouldn't flood in where the temple was, and it would rush into this pool and it would stir. And they made this philosophy out of it. They made this idea that an angel stirs the water, even though they controlled it. An angel stirs the water, and if you can get in first, you get healed. It was corrupt. It was so corrupt, and Jesus saw straight through it, which is why he probably walked straight into this pool of Bethesda looking for someone who's been waiting their entire life to be healed and saying, "What about you, sir? Do you want to be healed?" So I can't get to the water. No one can help me when the pool gets stirred. You can imagine, like, mate, this thing's a hoax. You don't have to wait for the water to get stirred. He just says to him, "Get up, take your mat, walk out." The guy full of faith just gets up and walks out. And now the religious leaders are so angry with Jesus because he's called them out on their bluff of the corruption, of the religiosity, which says who can come in and who has to stay out. And God's not like that, because he demonstrates his righteousness in the fact that you are all welcome. You are all welcome. Got time for one more story? This is other time, right? You read it everywhere. This other time, Jesus, he's walking through this crowd, and this ruler comes up to him and says, Sir, please, can you come with me? My little daughter is dying. And so Jesus wastes no time. He says, "Sure, I'll come to your house and we're going to heal her." So Jesus he's considered the rabbi, the prophet. He's the one that everyone's talking about. So this ruler comes up, "Can you please come and heal my daughter?" And so he's on his way. And as he's on his way, something happens. We'll come back to what happens right here. He's on his way, and all of a sudden, the attendants of this man's house come up to him and say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's dead." Come on, JP. What a talent, man. You can play the guitar and the keyboard. Do you want this microphone as well? I reckon he could. So Jesus, "Please come and heal my daughter." And so he's on his way. And right here, they say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter is dead." Why do they say that? Why do they say to Jesus, "Don't bother him anymore. Your daughter's dead"? Because a rabbi, once you touch a dead person, you are unclean, which means you can't perform any priestly duties. You can't go into synagogue, you can't read the Torah, you can't do any of those types of things. For a whole 7 days, you are now unclean. So they're saying, don't bother the teacher, because if he comes into our house, because your daughter's already dead, now he will become unclean. We'll all be unclean. There's no use sending him now. Do you know what happened right in the middle? There's this fascinating story that happens right here. But I could just imagine the whole crowd going, "Don't you know what's just happened?" The men come up and they say to Jesus, to the synagogue ruler, "Don't bother the teacher because she's dead," which means he'll be unclean. And you can imagine everyone looking at him like, have you not just seen what's gone on? It doesn't matter that he's unclean, because right here between the man saying, "Can you come and heal my daughter?" and the attendant saying, "Don't bother him anymore, she's dead," right here in the middle, this woman who's been unclean for like 12 years, this continual period blood that she's had for 12 years, which makes her completely unclean, which means she is not allowed into church. She's ostracized. She's out. She does not belong. And she thinks to herself, if I can just come up through the crowd with no one knowing and just touch the hem of his garment, I know I'll be healed. And right there at the moment, Jesus stops with the crowd and he says, who touched me? And the disciples say, who touched you? We're all touching you. Everyone's crowding around you. Everyone wants to be you. And he says, no, someone touched me. I felt power go out. And he's looking and looking and looking. And I always wondered about this story because I'm learning more about how God does not shame people, how he doesn't embarrass people. And so I'm wondering, why on earth would he want this woman to come forward and to tell her story? And she eventually comes and she says, it was me, and tells the whole story and has to tell the whole crowd. You can imagine how embarrassing that would be? I'm like, what's the importance of her telling this story? Jesus, why would you do that? Why would you make her tell that story? Righteousness is meant to be this hospitality of inclusion, and now you're calling her out? No, he's not. Because when she tells that story, that she touched him, and she's been unclean for 12 years, guess who's now unclean? Jesus. And why is that important? Because a few moments later, the attendants of this man who said, please come and heal my daughter, when they come up and say, don't bother the teacher anymore, she's dead, he'll be unclean. You can imagine the whole crowd going, he's already unclean. This woman touched him. He's already unclean. So the whole crowd goes to this guy's house to raise to life this dead daughter. Don't you get the feeling there's so much more going on than we read? But we read so often with our own lenses thinking that God is already angry with us. So he's angry at this woman for touching him. That's not what's happening. Everything about God is gracious and compassionate. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in love and faithfulness. And everything we know from the first parts of the scriptures is our attempt to get to know God, which is incorrect, which is why everything was always telling the story about when he would finally come and the full revelation of who God is in the risen Christ. God is like Jesus. He's exactly like Jesus. He's not what we've thought. He's not what the Old Testament has prescribed. He's not these angry experiences that we've had from other churches. He's not any of the things that we've experienced that are negative. God holds out all by himself. And his invitation is to you to come. The righteousness of God is his deepest desire to open a door and make a way for you. Do you know why it's safe for you to be here in church? My dad used to say he's not a church guy. My dad I'd try to get him to come along to church every now and then. He's like, oh no, if I went in there, the roof would fall in. And no matter how many times I've said to him, no, they make churches really good these days. The roof's not going to fall in. What he's truly saying is he thinks that God is mad at him, angry at him because of the way he's lived his life. And I just keep thinking, Dad, if only you knew. That's the picture we've all given about God. That's not who he is. You see, we need people to say sorry before we forgive them. And if they don't say sorry, we want to make them pay, don't we? Do you know God forgave you before you said sorry? Before you even realized you were in a mess, he forgave you. God was in Jesus Christ, reconciling the whole world to himself. You're in the right place today. That's why I'm putting out the 4-week challenge. Come back next week, and the week after, and the week after. Let the beautiful words of God's nature refresh your soul. Let these guys and others here who we're all practicing trying to figure out how to love God the best we can. We're trying to reveal him, and we do poor attempts at that. And many of us today, we've walked so far away from God for so long. And when you keep walking further and further away from God, when you finally come to this moment like today where you're like, I want to come back to God. You feel like you've just gone so far, right? You feel like there's going to be so much ground to make up if I turn around. But if you talk to any of us who have done this, you realize the moment you take that brave step and turn around, God's right here. He's not right back where you left him. He's right here. He doesn't make you walk all that way again. He's right here. It's not about what you're doing right now. It's about which way your shoulders are facing. That's the only question I've got for you today. Which way are your shoulders facing? Are you willing to turn back? Say, God, here I am. Right where you're sitting, just say yes to Jesus. Turn your shoulders back toward him. Say, God, here I am. Save me. I thank you that you love me. You've already forgiven me. God, I ask you now to save me. I say yes to you. I say yes to you, Jesus. I say yes. And you can do that every day. Just say yes. Keep saying yes. Keep saying yes. We say yes to you. We want to help you in that decision of saying yes. And I know John will, I don't know if it's John or who's coming up, but yeah, someone will share you with that. We've got different rooms around the islands where we can welcome you, include you, do this journey with us. It's been such a joy to be with you. Truly, John and Katie, thanks for having us. It's cool. Mahalo.
Thank you, church family, for joining us online today. If you just made a decision to follow Jesus, we want to encourage you. That is the greatest decision you can possibly make. We would love to help you along on the journey. A simple way to do that is just to click the link below, and there's a button that says, I've decided to follow Jesus. We would love to give you some practical next steps. The other thing we want to tell you about is how you make the house a home is you join community. We believe you grow within community, and we do that through rooms. We've got rooms that meet all over the island and also all over the islands, and even on the mainland. We're starting live rooms that are going to be happening on Sunday mornings, and we are so excited to bring the message of the gospel everywhere and into your living room. We also want to thank our giving community, those who give week in and week out. There's a link below that you can click on, but we are so thankful for your generosity. We believe the life of the generous, it gets larger and larger. Thank you for sowing into this soil. Thank you for being committed to this journey with us, and we'll see you back here next time.